The skies above Mars burned red, not from its thin atmosphere or its rust-colored soil, but from fire raining down from orbit. It happened so fast. One moment life was ordinary. Families were working in the domes, children were playing in the artificial parks, miners were returning from the iron pits, and ships moved in and out of orbit with routine calm. Humanity had spent over 100 years building its home there, turning the barren desert into a place where hope could grow. For the first time in history, people had believed Mars was more than just survival. It was a future. Then the stars changed. At first, they looked like meteors, points of light streaking toward the planet in silence. People stopped in the streets and gazed up in wonder. But wonder turned to fear when alarms screamed through every dome. The lights were not meteors. They were ships. Enemy ships. The Skorath had come. No warning. No message. No declaration of war. Only fire. The first blasts tore through orbital stations, turning them into sudden suns, blinding those watching from the ground. The second wave struck the domes. Transparent ceilings designed to protect humans from the cold, thin air, shattered like glass. In an instant, whole districts were ripped open, their people sucked into the void or buried in the rubble. The air filled with screams, alarms, and the sound of rushing winds that meant death. The survivors ran. Parents carried children. Soldiers scrambled for weapons. Medics tried to treat the wounded as the sky kept falling. But there was no shelter. The Skorath did not stop. Their bombs were precise, merciless. They weren't targeting defenses. They were targeting people. By the time the first day ended, Mars was a graveyard. On Europa, under the icy crust, human colonies had lived in fragile peace for decades. They had carved homes under the ice, built greenhouses glowing with artificial sunlight, and created towns where once there had only been frozen wasteland. Life there was quiet, hard, but filled with determination. But the Skorath found them too. They shattered the ice with weapons that boiled the seas beneath. Habitats collapsed under crushing water. Generations of work, entire communities were erased as pressure tore apart the domes. Messages of panic reached Earth and Mars in the last moments. People crying for help, children begging to be saved, voices cut off mid-scream as the sea swallowed them whole. And Earth could do nothing but listen. Everywhere humanity had reached, the story was the same. Colonies on Titan, on Ceres, on orbital rings, all burned. The aliens moved like predators, striking fast and without pause, leaving no survivors where they could help it. They didn't take land, didn't strip mines, didn't harvest resources. They simply destroyed. It was cruelty without reason. Some believed it was a warning. Others said it was punishment. Some test humanity had unknowingly failed. But no one truly understood. What was clear, what could not be denied, was that the Skorath had come to break the human spirit. And in many ways, they succeeded. On Earth, the survivors' transmissions played across every screen. Mothers screamed as the sky collapsed over their children. Miners cried out as fire buried them alive. Soldiers shouted oaths, desperate to hold the line before silence claimed them too. Billions of voices, billions of lives, snuffed out like candles. People fell into despair. Politicians argued. Generals screamed for impossible defenses. Families wept as news spread that no help could reach the outer worlds in time. Humanity had dreamed of the stars, but now the stars had turned against them. The colonies were burning. The future was dying. Hope itself seemed broken. But in the ashes, something stirred. Far beneath Earth's oceans, currents began to shift. In the forests, trees grew faster, bending unnaturally toward the skies. Storms gathered with strange strength as though the world itself was trembling. On Mars, where blood and dust mixed in endless fields, the ground hummed faintly, unnoticed by the dead and dying. It was subtle, too subtle for grieving humans to see. But something ancient was watching, something vast, something hidden. For centuries, scientists had whispered that Earth was too perfect, too alive. They said the balance of life was unnatural, as if guided by unseen hands. Humanity never listened. Humanity thought the Earth was just a home, just a rock in space that happened to give them life. But they were wrong. The Skorath thought they were punishing humanity. They thought they were breaking us, scattering us, reducing us to dust and memory. But with every bomb that fell, with every life taken, with every colony burned, they awoke something that had always been there. Not a god, not a weapon, Something older, something deeper, something patient, the mother of worlds, Gaia. And her fury was only beginning to rise. On Earth, the people mourned. Cities held vigils that lasted through the night. Screens replayed the final transmissions from Mars, Europa, and Titan. Faces of lost families appeared in endless streams, smiling pictures of people who no longer lived. The grief was too heavy to carry, and yet the people carried it anyway. Humanity had been wounded, perhaps beyond healing. But in that silence of mourning, the world itself began to change. It started small, so small that no one noticed at first. A farmer in South America swore his crops grew twice as fast as usual after the colonies fell. Fishermen near the Pacific spoke of strange tides, pulling and pushing in rhythms that had never existed before. Meteorologists stared at storms on their monitors, confused by how the wind seemed to move with intent, striking certain coasts while avoiding others. At first, they thought it was coincidence. Just strange weather. Just chance. But it wasn't. Beneath the oceans, the currents were shifting in patterns older than history. Whales sang differently, their voices deeper, filled with echoes no human had ever recorded. In the forests of Africa, ancient trees twisted toward the skies as though reaching to shield something unseen. And in the heart of Earth's crust, sensors picked up faint vibrations, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Gaia was stirring. Scientists had always argued about Earth. Some said it was a miracle planet, too perfect to be an accident, too rich in life, too balanced. Others dismissed it, saying it was only probability, only the laws of nature. But when humanity spread to other worlds, they learned the truth in silence. No other planet was like Earth. Mars was dry and cold, even after a century of human effort. Europa's seas were hostile and alien. Titan's skies were suffocating. Everywhere humanity went, survival was possible, but it was fragile. On Earth, life flourished like a wildfire. It had always been this way. And now, when her children were under attack, Earth showed that she was not just alive, she was aware. The Skorath had not noticed it yet. To them, storms were just weather, quakes were just chance, and growing forests were meaningless. They did not understand the danger of what they had woken, but the humans began to whisper. They whispered after earthquakes swallowed alien machines whole, as though the ground itself rejected them. They whispered after hurricanes struck invaders with unnatural accuracy, tearing ships from the sky while leaving human settlements untouched. They whispered when strange lights flickered in the oceans, chasing Skorath submarines into the depths, never to be seen again. The whispers grew into belief, and belief grew into hope. On Mars, where the soil was red with human blood, something else stirred. The ground vibrated, faint but constant, almost like the planet was humming. Dust storms rose without warning, striking enemy troops with blinding ferocity. Colonists who survived told of strange shapes in the storm, forms that moved like warriors protecting the broken. On Europa, after the domes collapsed, the oceans should have been silent. Instead, the seas became violent, boiling with sudden heat. Cracks in the ice opened and closed as if alive. Alien ships that dove beneath the surface were swallowed by walls of water, their signals ending in static. Survivors swore they saw shadows in the deep, vast and ancient, moving with purpose. On Titan, geysers erupted without cause, spewing fire and gas that choked alien engines. The ground itself split, swallowing machines into endless pits. Colonists who escaped said it felt as though the moon had decided to fight back. These were not random accidents. These were not coincidences. The colonies, the places humans had touched and lived, were answering. Earth was not just a planet. Mars was not just rock. Europa was not just ice. Titan was not just methane seas. Everywhere humanity had built, something had listened, something had learned, something had waited. The bombs of the Skorath had not only burned human homes, they had awakened Gaia. And Gaia was not just Earth. She was the breath of life that spread wherever humanity went, the spark that turned dead soil into home. Humanity had thought they were alone in the cold of space, small children trying to survive against an endless night. But now in their darkest hour they realized they were not alone. They never had been. Their mother had always been there, silent, patient, watching. The Skorath saw weakness in humanity's tears. They believed their bombs had broken the spirit of the Dirtborn, but they did not see the truth. Humanity was not broken. They were changing. Their grief was hardening into something stronger. And with every passing day, Gaia's power was rising. The storms would grow. The seas would rage. The ground would tremble with fury. And when the time came, the Skorath would learn. They had not made humanity weaker. They had made humanity unstoppable, because they had awoken the sleeping mother. And the mother does not forgive. When the Skorath returned, they came with arrogance. They had already crushed the outer colonies. They had burned Mars, drowned Europa, and shattered Titan. To them, humanity was broken, scattered, and weak. They expected no resistance. They expected no fight. But what they found waiting for them was not silence. It was fury. The skies above Earth darkened as their fleets approached. The aliens descended through clouds heavy with storms, their warships spreading across the planet like shadows. They landed their machines in the fields, their soldiers marching into cities with cold precision. They believed the fight was already won. Then the world struck back. Hurricanes rose from the oceans with terrifying speed. Not natural storms, not chaotic winds, these were storms that moved like weapons. They curved toward the alien craft with uncanny accuracy. Ships that had hovered proudly above the seas were torn from the sky, twisted in wind so strong their metal frames snapped. Alien pilots screamed through their comms as their craft spiraled downward into waves that swallowed them whole. The survivors had no time to recover, for the seas themselves rose up in walls of water, smashing their machines to fragments. No human fired the first shot. Gaia did. On the ground, the alien armies pushed forward, confident and unafraid. Their walkers crushed the soil as they marched across plains and forests. But the earth had grown restless. The ground split beneath them, swallowing whole columns of soldiers. Quakes shook with impossible timing, collapsing cliffs and burying invaders alive. In some places, rivers changed course in a single night, drowning the alien camps in floods that carried away weapons and bodies alike. The aliens thought it was accident. They thought it was random nature. But humans saw the truth. They saw how the earth struck only where invaders stood, leaving their villages untouched. They saw the way storms turned at the last second, saving human lives while destroying alien fleets. It was not chance. It was not luck. It was protection. On Mars, the fury spread even further. The survivors of the colony, broken and starving, had hidden in caves and ruins. They expected only death, but when the Skorath returned to finish them, they faced storms of red dust rising like endless walls. The winds howled with rage, tearing apart alien machines with grains sharper than blades. Colonists swore they saw shapes in the storm, figures of light and shadow walking beside them, shielding them from fire. When alien troops fired blindly into the dust, the bullets struck nothing. When they tried to advance, the ground itself cracked, opening canyons that separated them from their prey. Mars was no longer silent. Mars was alive. And on Europa, the oceans roared. The Skorath had believed the colony destroyed. Its domes shattered, its people drowned. But the seas had not forgotten. When the aliens dove beneath the ice again, seeking to build bases in the deep, the waters turned against them. Submarines were crushed by pressure they could not withstand. Ice shifted with deliberate timing, sealing exits and trapping them in blackness. And in the shadows of the sea, things moved. Shapes larger than ships, ancient and patient. Some survivors told of massive eyes glowing in the dark, watching, waiting, hunting. No Skorath vessel that entered the waters ever returned. The oceans had become a grave. Even Titan joined the fury. Its surface split open with geysers of methane and fire, shooting into the skies and choking alien engines. Landing craft were buried in sudden eruptions, swallowed whole by pits that had never existed before. The aliens struggled to adapt, but no matter what they built, no matter where they stood, the moon itself fought them. The places humanity had touched, the places where they had lived, worked and dreamed were no longer passive. They were weapons. They were alive. They were Gaia's children. For the first time, the Skorath began to fear. Reports spread through their fleets of unnatural storms, of quakes that struck with purpose, of seas that devoured armies whole. Soldiers whispered that the Dirtborn were protected by something greater than technology. Commanders dismissed it as fear, but fear spreads quickly, and as the fear spread, so too did resistance. Humanity, watching from the ruins of their colonies, realized something incredible. They were not alone. The world itself was fighting for them. For the first time since the bombs had fallen, they felt hope burning again. Men and women picked up weapons. Pilots climbed back into broken ships. Children carried messages through ruined streets, their faces set with determination far beyond their years. The aliens had wanted to break their spirit. Instead, they had given them a reason to stand together, a reason to fight harder, a reason to endure. The Skorath had power. Their weapons could level cities. Their ships could burn skies. Their soldiers could crush armies. But humanity had something they would never understand. A mother who refused to abandon her children. Every storm, every quake, every eruption carried a message, a promise. Gaia was awake, and her fury would not stop until every invader was driven from her children's home. The first storms had been Gaia's answer. The first quakes had been her warning, but humanity knew the truth. They could not let their mother fight alone. If the Earth herself rose to protect her children, then her children must rise too. At first it seemed impossible. Humanity was shattered, grieving, scattered across the stars. Whole colonies were gone. Fleets were broken. Factories lay in ruins. How could a wounded species stand against an empire that commanded 1,000 warships? But grief has two faces. It can break the heart, or it can turn sorrow into iron. And when the Skorath killed billions, they did not only wound humanity, they forged them. In the ashes, unity was born. On Earth, the leaders of every nation gathered. It did not matter if they had once been enemies. Borders no longer meant anything. Old rivalries, old grudges, old wounds, all were forgotten. There was only one truth now: fight or be erased. For the first time in history, humanity spoke with one voice. Factories roared to life again, building ships faster than ever before. Old machines left to rust in forgotten hangars were dragged into the light, repaired with trembling hands. Weapons hidden in bunkers, relics of wars long past, were armed again. Scientists worked without sleep, turning desperation into invention. Engineers patched ships with whatever they could find. Soldiers trained until their bodies broke, then stood up and trained again. Every person, young and old, had a place in the fight. The Skorath expected surrender. They expected humanity to curl up and die quietly. Instead, they watched as the Dirtborn stood, bloodied but unbroken. They watched as broken fleets gathered again, their ships scarred but flying. They watched as soldiers who had lost everything still marched, still raised their banners, still shouted with voices that shook the sky. It was a sight the Skorath had never seen before. A prey species that refused to stay prey, and behind them always was Gaia. The storms gave them cover. The seas shielded their ships. The ground opened to swallow enemy weapons while leaving human forces untouched. Humanity fought harder because they knew they were not fighting alone. Every soldier felt it. Every pilot felt it. The very air seemed to push them forward, whispering that their mother was with them. It gave them courage. It gave them fire. There were sacrifices, countless ones. Whole squadrons flew into battles knowing they would not return. Ships rammed alien cruisers, breaking themselves apart to save their fleets. Families gave their last food to soldiers, starving so that the defenders could fight one more day. And still humanity fought. They did not fight for conquest. They did not fight for glory. They fought for survival, for the memory of those already lost, and for the children who still lived. On the front lines, the change was clear. Human fleets once scattered and afraid now moved with unity, striking like a single blade. Fighters darted through enemy fire, fearless, reckless, unyielding. Troops on the ground used ruined cities as traps, turning every street into a battlefield the Skorath could not control. Every life lost slowed the enemy. Every sacrifice carried weight, and always in the distance storms raged, quakes roared, seas boiled. Nature itself fought alongside them, punishing every Skorath step, reminding the invaders that this was not their home. Hope spread like wildfire. Children who had seen their parents die now carried food and messages to soldiers refusing to hide. Families painted the walls of ruins with words of defiance. We are still here. We will not fall. In every bunker, in every shelter, in every city still standing, the same vow was whispered. We fight. Even in the colonies where only ruins remained, the survivors rose. On Mars, broken miners turned their tools into weapons, hiding in storms and striking like ghosts. On Europa, Divers who had escaped the drowning domes used the treacherous seas against the enemy, guiding them into traps where the ocean itself finished the work. On Titan, engineers turned collapsing facilities into bombs, burying alien machines in fire and gas. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them unstoppable. The Skorath, for all their power, began to feel something new: resistance. Their victories slowed. Their armies bled. Their fleets lost more ships than they could replace. They looked at humanity and saw not the weak prey they had expected, but something fierce, something stubborn, something impossible to kill. And the humans themselves, standing in fire and ruin, realized the truth. They had found their strength. Humanity had been many things: explorers, dreamers, builders, and sometimes destroyers. But now they were united by one simple truth: survival. They were no longer divided by borders, by wealth, by color, or creed. They were one people, one species, standing together with their mother at their side. And as long as even one of them drew breath, they would never stop fighting. So humanity stood, bloodied, scarred, but unbroken. And with every storm that raged, every quake that shook, every ship that launched into the fire, they whispered a promise: "We are the children of Earth, we will endure, and we will make the stars remember us." The Skorath had conquered countless species before. They had burned worlds, crushed empires, and erased civilizations from history. To them, humanity was nothing different, just another prey, another fragile race too weak to survive the fire. Even as storms tore their ships apart, even as quakes swallowed their armies, even as seas drowned their machines, the Skorath still laughed. They mocked humanity in their transmissions. They called them dirt-born, weak creatures who hid behind storms like children behind their mother's skirts. They claimed Gaia's fury was nothing more than coincidence, that nature itself could never match the power of their fleets. Arrogance was their shield, but arrogance does not stop bullets. When the Skorath pushed deeper into Earth's lands, they met human soldiers who no longer broke at the sight of alien machines. They met fleets that fought with reckless courage. They met survivors who would rather die on their feet than live as slaves. The aliens expected fear. Instead, they found fury. In orbit, battles burned across the skies. Human ships were outnumbered 5-1, sometimes 10-1. Their hulls were patched, their weapons outdated, their engines barely holding together. Against the sleek warships of the Skorath, they looked like rusted skeletons, but human pilots fought like demons. They pushed their ships beyond safe limits, diving into fire that no sane warrior would face. They fought not for glory, but for the memory of their dead, for the promise of their children, for the survival of their kind. Skorath commanders laughed at first. They thought the humans' reckless charges were foolish, that desperation made them easy prey. But laughter turned to silence when damaged human fighters pierced their formations, striking at weak points with impossible precision. Even in defeat, humanity struck blows that shook the enemy. A single human cruiser, its engines failing, rammed an alien flagship, tearing both into pieces. A squadron of fighters overloaded their reactors, turning themselves into living bombs that wiped out entire enemy wings. To the Skorath, these acts were madness. To humans, they were sacrifice on the ground. The arrogance of the Skorath turned against them. Their soldiers marched into ruined cities with confidence, certain their superior weapons would guarantee victory. But the streets became traps. Buildings collapsed on command, guided by human engineers who knew every brick, every alley, every corner. Snipers struck from shadows. Mines hidden beneath rubble ripped through armored walkers. Children carried messages through tunnels the aliens could not follow, turning every block into a battlefield. The Skorath had believed humans were fragile, but fragile things do not fight like this. Fragile things do not strike with such fury, nor endure with such strength. For every human the aliens killed, 2 more rose to take their place. And always, behind humanity's resistance, came Gaia's hand. When alien artillery prepared to fire, storms swept in and scattered their aim. When armored vehicles pushed across plains, the ground split and swallowed them. When soldiers tried to cross rivers, floods rose and tore them away. It was not just war. It was judgment. The Skorath commanders raged. They demanded answers from their scientists, but no answer came. They demanded obedience from their troops, but fear grew in their eyes. The soldiers whispered of a living world, a mother who fought beside her children. They began to hesitate. They began to doubt, and in war, doubt is death. Still, the Skorath clung to their arrogance. They believed their numbers would save them. Their weapons would crush resistance, their empire could not be challenged. They called humanity foolish for fighting, claiming it was better to bow and die quietly than to rise and suffer. But the humans had already made their choice. They would not bow. They would not break. They would not stop. The arrogance of the Skorath blinded them to the truth. Humanity was changing. What had once been scattered nations was now a single force. What had once been fragile colonies were now fortresses of fury. What had once been despair had become unshakable resolve. And with Gaia at their side, the humans were learning. They adapted. They endured. They struck harder with every battle. The Skorath had mocked them as dirt-born, but the dirt itself was rising against them. One night, as a storm howled over the ruins of a fallen city, a human commander stood on the broken walls and shouted across the battlefield for all to hear. "You call us dirt-born? Then remember this, even dirt can bury you alive." The soldiers cheered. The skies thundered, and for the first time in their long history of conquest, the Skorath began to wonder if they had made a mistake, because arrogance is powerful until it meets something stronger, and nothing is stronger than a people who refuse to die. The Battle of Sol was meant to be and the Skorath gathered their full might, 1,000 warships strong, orbiting at the edge of the solar system. Their commander spoke with pride, calling it the final blow, the strike that would erase humanity from existence. They promised their soldiers victory, and they promised their empire that the dirt-born would be remembered only as dust. Against them stood humanity's last fleet. Barely 200 ships, most of them patched together with scraps, their crews exhausted, their weapons short on ammunition. From the outside, it looked hopeless. 200 against 1,000. No one should have survived, but humanity was no longer fighting alone. As the alien armada moved in, the planets themselves seemed to tremble. Earth storms gathered into walls of thunder. Mars raged with dust storms that tore across its deserts. Europa's seas surged with hidden fury. Even Titan split with eruptions of fire. The system itself seemed to awaken. The human fleet took their places near Earth, the homeworld they swore they would protect until their last breath. They knew the odds. They knew death waited for them. Yet not a single ship turned away. Pilots strapped themselves in with calm faces. Soldiers whispered prayers not for survival but for courage. Families sent their last messages of love. Every human in the fleet carried the same thought. If we fall together. The battle began with fire. Alien cannons lit the void, pouring destruction across the skies. Human ships staggered under the first wave, hulls cracking, shields collapsing. One by one, vessels exploded in silence, their crews dying without a scream, but the survivors did not break. They charged. Fragile ships darted between enemy cruisers, striking with precision. Fighters swarmed through impossible gaps, sacrificing themselves to tear apart larger vessels. Broken frigates rammed alien warships, shattering both in a storm of fire. Every human death carried a price, and the Skorath paid it in blood and steel. And then, something changed. The human fleet began to move differently, faster, sharper. Their weapons struck harder. Their shields held longer. It was as if invisible hands guided them, as if the stars themselves bent to their will. The pilots felt it first. They swore their ships responded quicker than ever, engines roaring with unnatural strength. Gunners found their shots landing true, as though the void itself carried their fire to the enemy. Captains felt a presence like a whisper in the back of their minds, urging them where to strike, where to move, where to survive. It was Gaia. She was not only on Earth, she was in every planet, every moon, every corner of the system humanity had touched. And now in their darkest hour, she poured her strength into her children. The Skorath commanders grew angry. They could not understand how a fleet so small could hold against their might. They shouted orders, demanded harder strikes, unleashed every weapon at their disposal. But the more they pushed, the more the battle turned against them. Storms from Earth disrupted their communications. Dust clouds from Mars blinded their sensors. Europa's gravity pulled their ships into dangerous paths. Titan's eruptions filled the void with chaos. It was as if the entire system itself was a weapon, fighting at humanity's side. For every human ship that fell, 5 Skorath ships followed. On the ground, humanity watched. Civilians gathered in ruined cities, eyes fixed on the skies, listening to the reports of the battle. Every loss cut them deep, but every victory lit fire in their hearts. They prayed, they wept, they cheered. And in their cheers there was no despair, only defiance. One child in a shelter whispered, "Mama, the world is fighting for us." And her mother, tears in her eyes, answered, "Yes, my love." And so are we. Hours passed. The void burned with wreckage, lit by fire and shattered metal. The Skorath fleet, once proud and unstoppable, faltered. Their commanders grew desperate, ordering retreats, trying to regroup. But the humans pressed on, relentless. For the first time, the invaders felt what it meant to be prey. At the height of the battle, a single human flagship, broken and aflame, charged straight into the heart of the alien fleet. Its captain sent one last message to all of humanity. "We are the children of Earth, remember us. Fight on." The ship detonated, tearing through dozens of enemy vessels, breaking the enemy's formation. In that single act of sacrifice, the tide turned forever. When dawn rose over Earth, the battle was over. The skies were filled with wreckage, human and alien alike. Of the 200 human ships, less than 50 remained. But the Skorath had lost more than 600. The rest fled, screaming across the stars, chased by the fury of a people they had underestimated. The Battle of Sol was not just survival. It was a message humanity had endured. Humanity had stood. Humanity had fought beside their mother, and together they had won. The turning point had come. The Skorath had believed their victory was certain, but they had never faced a species like this. They had never faced a people who could not be broken, a mother who would not let her children fall. From that day forward, humanity was no longer prey. They were something else, something the galaxy would never forget. They were fury. They were fire. They were human. The Skorath had never known fear. For centuries, they had conquered without question. Their fleets swept across the stars like fire. Their soldiers marched like shadows, and no enemy had ever withstood their power. To them, war was not danger, it was routine. Victory was always certain, but after the Battle of Sol, certainty shattered. The survivors of their grand fleet limped away, their ships scarred and broken, their soldiers shaken. In their silence there was something new, something alien to them. Doubt. They had faced prey who refused to die. They had faced storms that struck with the precision of weapons. They had faced a mother who fought beside her children. And in that battle they had lost more than ships. They had lost their pride, yet arrogance dies slowly. The Skorath leadership refused to admit defeat. They told their empire that Sol was only a small setback, that the Dirtborn had merely been lucky. They promised a new assault, larger and stronger, one that would finally erase humanity. But in the hearts of their soldiers, fear grew like a seed. Whispers spread through their ranks, whispers of a living world, of storms with purpose, of oceans that swallowed whole fleets, of humans who fought even when surrounded by death. Fear spread faster than commands. Meanwhile, humanity did not rest. The survivors of the battle rebuilt their ships, patched their wounds, and prepared for the next storm. Factories roared with life. Colonists in the ruins of Mars and Titan worked day and night to build weapons from the wreckage of their fallen homes. Scientists turned desperation into genius, inventing faster engines, sharper weapons, stronger shields, and everywhere Gaia's presence grew stronger. Storms sharpened with uncanny accuracy. Quakes struck exactly when needed. The seas themselves seemed to guard human shores. Humanity and their mother moved as one, no longer separate, no longer divided. For the first time in history, humanity did not feel small in the galaxy. They felt vast, unbreakable, infinite. When the Skorath returned, their numbers were smaller, their confidence fractured. They came not as conquerors, but as hunters, desperate to prove they still held power. They struck at scattered colonies, hoping to crush the survivors. But wherever they went, they met resistance. Miners turned soldiers, farmers turned warriors. Children who had lost their families carried rifles and refused to fall. The aliens were strong, but humanity was stronger in spirit. And the worlds themselves fought back. On Mars, dust storms buried their armies until not even their bones remained. On Europa, vast shadows rose from the seas, crushing their ships in silence. On Titan, Geysers tore through their machines, burning them in flame. On Earth, hurricanes struck their fleets until the skies were clear of invaders. It was no longer war. It was retribution. The Skorath began to flee. At first, they retreated to regroup, but every regroup ended in disaster. Every time they tried to gather strength, humanity and Gaia tore them apart. Their fleets fractured. Their soldiers deserted. Their leaders shouted of honor, but honor could not silence the truth. The hunters had become the hunted. One by one, their outposts fell. Human fleets, once broken, now hunted them across the stars. Ships that had been patched together with scraps now moved with the fury of storms. Captains who had lost everything led their crews with iron hearts. Every battle became a victory. Every victory another nail in the coffin of the Skorath. The aliens had thought themselves eternal. But eternity ended under the weight of human defiance, and the galaxy watched. Other species, long silent in fear of the Skorath, heard the stories. Stories of storms that fought like weapons. Stories of humans who refused to die. Stories of a mother who rose to protect her children. For the first time, the galaxy saw the Empire bleed, and in that sight, courage was born in others. Whispers spread. If the Dirtborn can resist, perhaps we all can. The Skorath, once feared, were now running. Their fleets scattered like frightened animals, their soldiers broken, their empire trembling. They had come to burn colonies and erase humanity. Instead, they had awakened Gaia's fury and revealed humanity's strength. Their fall was not just defeat. It was humiliation. In the ruins of their last great fleet, a human commander stood before the survivors and spoke the truth that burned in every heart. They thought we were weak. They thought we were nothing. They thought their fire would break us. But all they did was teach us who we truly are. The soldiers cheered. The skies thundered. The ground trembled, and the Skorath, listening from the shadows, finally understood what they had created. They had not destroyed humanity. They had forged it. The fall of the Skorath was not the end of war. Battles would still come. Blood would still be spilled. But the tide had turned forever. The empire of fear was broken, and the children of Earth stood unafraid. Because in the ashes of their colonies they had found something greater than survival. They had found unity. They had found fury. They had found themselves. The war was not quiet when it ended. The Skorath had fallen, but the echoes of their cruelty lingered across the stars. Burned colonies floated in silence. Scarred worlds still cried with pain, and families mourned for those who would never return. Victory did not erase loss. It carved it deeper into memory. And yet, amidst the grief, there was hope. On Earth, survivors gathered in the ruins of cities. They planted gardens in the ashes, children's laughter rising again between broken walls. Farmers returned to their fields, their hands steady, their hearts stronger. Soldiers laid down their weapons and wept at graves, promising their fallen that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The people looked to the sky not with fear, but with pride. They knew now that the stars no longer belonged to invaders. The stars belonged to them. The leaders of humanity stood together for the first time in history. No borders, no rival flags, no division of race or nation. They had suffered the same wounds, lost the same blood, carried the same fury. Now they shared the same promise. Never again would they be prey. Never again would their children live in fear. Never again would they fight each other when the galaxy itself threatened their survival. The age of division was over. The age of unity had begun. Gaia watched. Her storms calmed, her seas rested, her mountains stood tall. She had risen in fury when her children were threatened, and now she rested in quiet pride. But her presence did not fade. Humanity could still feel her, a whisper in the earth, a warmth in the wind, a strength in their bones. She had revealed herself not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as a mother. And like all mothers, she had given her children more than protection. She had given them a future. The galaxy trembled at the new order. The fall of the Skorath spread like fire. Races who had once cowered under their rule rose in rebellion. Chains were broken, empires crumbled, and across the stars voices cried for freedom. And in every uprising, one name was spoken: humanity. The Dirtborn, once ignored, once despised, had become a symbol. Not just of survival, but of defiance, of unity, of hope. To the galaxy, they were no longer small. They were the people who stood beside their living world. who fought storms and fire with unbreakable hearts. They were the people who had turned fear into fury, loss into strength, and weakness into victory. And humanity made a choice. They could have become conquerors. They could have replaced the Skorath, ruled with the same iron hand, claimed revenge across the stars. But they did not. Instead, they offered hands of friendship. They helped rebuild where the Skorath had destroyed. They shared food where famine raged. They opened their doors to those who had been enslaved. Humanity remembered what it felt like to be hunted, to be broken, to be small. And they swore no other race would feel that way again. The survivors of the fleets, the scarred captains, the weary pilots, the soldiers who had lost everything, became teachers. They told stories not of glory but of sacrifice. They spoke of the names of the fallen, of the worlds that had burned, of the promise born in ashes. Children listened with wide eyes, not to tales of heroes, but to the truth of courage. They learned that strength was not in power but in unity, not in conquest but in standing together when the world tried to tear you apart. A new generation grew, carrying both memory and promise in their hearts. In time, a great monument rose on Earth. It was not built from gold or stone, but from the wreckage of ships, human and Skorath alike. It stood not as a mark of war, but as a mark of endurance. At its base, carved into steel, were simple words. They came to burn our colonies, but they awakened our mother, and in her fury, we found ourselves. People from across the galaxy came to see it, and every visitor, human or alien, left with the same thought. That survival was not just about living, but about remembering, about promising, about becoming something greater than before. And so humanity looked to the stars again, not with fear, not with weakness, but with a promise that they would explore, not to conquer but to grow, a promise that they would protect, not just their own, but all who stood beside them, a promise that they would carry their mother's strength wherever they went. Because Gaia's children had learned the greatest truth, that the galaxy was vast, dangerous and cruel, but also full of life worth protecting. In the end, the Skorath had failed. Their bombs had burned colonies. Their fire had scarred worlds. Their cruelty had taken countless lives. But in trying to destroy humanity, they had given them something greater. They had awakened Gaia. They had awakened unity. They had awakened fury, and from that awakening came a promise that would echo through the stars for all time. Humanity would never fall.